So in the previous recording, we went over the Hardy-Weinberg equations and the definitions of all of the terms that you need to memorize. And then you need to practice working out word problems using the Hardy-Weinberg equations. And I have some practice sets for you to do that. But in this section of the lecture, we're going to go over evolution. So I'm going to back up a little bit. If you'll remember, equilibrium relies on these 5 criteria. All 5 must be held true if the population is going to stay in equilibrium. And what that means is that if any one of these statements changes, then that becomes the driver. Any one of these can then drive evolution. So for example, if equilibrium relies on no mutation, then if there begins to be a significant amount of mutation, that by itself can drive evolution. So over here, so these are the 5 criteria for equilibrium. Here are the 5 drivers of evolution. So high rates of mutation, high rates of gene flow, non-random mating, which means selective mating, which means individuals are choosing their mates based on preferred phenotypes. So that's non-random. Instead of the population size being very large, evolution can be caused by the population becoming or being very small. And selection. So you take the opposite of each of these criteria of equilibrium, and any one of these can cause evolution by itself. Sometimes you have more than one of these factors that's causing evolution, but you only need to have one to cause evolution. Now we're talking about evolution in the scientific sense of change in genetic structure of even one gene over generations. So those are the 5 drivers of evolution, how they line up to the 5 requirements of equilibrium. Make sure you memorize those. Honestly, you just need to remember one or the other, and then you can figure out the opposites. Okay, but here we are. Let me get my pen off. Okay, so let's talk about genetic variation. All populations have some kind of genetic variation. And that's because even a population, like you might think, okay, a population that reproduces asexually, even those have some level of genetic variation, maybe not very much, but some genetic variation, because DNA polymerase copies the chromosomes prior to cell division, whether that is a mitotic cell division or a meiotic cell division. And DNA polymerase makes mistakes, meaning if there's in the template DNA, if it's like ATGC, then when the polymerase looks at the A, it should add a T. When it looks at the T in the template, it should add an A. When it sees a G in the template, it should put a C. When it sees a C in the template, it should put a G. But sometimes it puts the wrong nucleotide. And that's a mutation. It creates a new allele immediately. Now, there are repair systems that will come in and repair those, but just like any system in biology, they are subject to failure as well. So some mutations don't get repaired, and therefore all populations have genetic variation because they all rely on DNA polymerase. So you can blame DNA polymerase and the failure of the repair systems they speculate probably 2/3 of all mutations that never get repaired, started off as a polymerase error. And then there are things that come from the environment and such that can also cause mutations. But we do blame polymerase for a lot of the mutation. Although mutation is good at a low level because it creates genetic variation, and evolution relies on that genetic variation, especially natural selection relies on genetic variation. So genetic variation at a low level, at a slow pace, is considered good. Too much can be negative, but the right amount. All right, so genetic variation arises when new alleles are created from existing alleles by the mutation of the allele. So as soon as that T is changed to an A, that's a new allele. Boom. And then sexual reproduction creates new combinations of alleles. You probably remember independent assortment. That means the chromosomes are assorted into gametes independent of one another, such that any combination of alleles can end up in a gamete. And then any two gametes, each of them being genetically unique, can fertilize each other or fuse, and that gives you a completely unique, genetically unique individual. So there are several points at which, several moving parts, I would say, that lead to a good amount of genetic variation. Now, some populations have more than others, but there's always some level of genetic variation. And again, we blame polymerase for a majority of that. All right, so let's talk about one of the drivers of evolution is, well, we just talked about mutation, and that in of itself changes the genetic structure of a population. That's why it's a driver of evolution. But let's talk about the case of having a small population. So remember that one of the criteria of equilibrium is very large population. So one of the drivers of evolution is small population. And this example is like extremely small. You're down to 10 individuals. And it kind of cracks me up that they picked rabbits, because I can tell you rabbits reproduce so quickly that it's not even like conceivable to me that you would ever have a population of just 10 rabbits. But let's pretend, okay? So rabbits was a really poor choice for the author here. But, 10 organisms of a certain species in an area at a particular time makes up a population. And let's say that if you're down to just 10, this is similar to like an endangered species case, where if you're down to just 10 individuals, then each individual in that population carries a fairly significant portion of the gene pool, because the gene pool is the sum total of the genes in the population. And if there's only 10 individuals, that means each individual carries 10% of the gene pool. If you have 1 million individuals in your population, then each individual only carries 1/1,000,000th of your gene pool. But when there's only 10, each one carries 1/10 of your gene pool. And so when each individual carries a significant portion of your gene pool, then if this guy gets hit by a car, that can change your allele frequencies just because of an accident. All right? Or let's say that in this population, let's say only these two individuals decide to mate just by like bad luck or chance. What if these ones were the only ones that made it? Which again, in rabbits is kind of crazy, but so there's a lot of importance to what happens in this population as to how much influence it's going to have on the next generation of the same population. In their scenario, they said, okay, what if these 5, they circled these 5 up here, what if these 5 are the only ones to reproduce? What might that give you? And again, this is all just, this might happen. There's a, 100 parallel universes, a million parallel universes where this could do something different. But let's say in this universe, these 5 mate. Then what you see is you're not getting proportionally that many of the recessive alleles passed on. So you can see in the allele frequencies here, 50-50, doesn't have to be that, but let's say you start at 50-50. Already in this population here, it's already shifted to 70%, 30% for the 2 alleles. And then they said, what if in this population only these 2 mate? So again, it's just a what if. Then what you can pretty quickly get to is a population that has all the brown allele. 100%, P is 1. That means all of the alleles are brown. 0 means none of the alleles are white. And we call that fixation and loss. So when an allele is fixed, that's when the frequency is 100%. And if one allele is fixed, that means the other allele is lost. And the thing about genetic drift is, even though it doesn't have to happen in this way, if you have a small population, the chances that you will get to fixation and loss pretty quickly are pretty high. And not just for the fur color gene, but also for all the other genes that are in the rabbit. So this just gives you a concept of what the risk is. And so this population, as long as it stays small, is losing genetic variation, because once all the alleles are brown, then it's very difficult to, the only way to get a white allele is for a new mutation to occur. And that can happen, but it's just, it tends to cause populations to lose genetic variation. The individuals become more genetically similar. And there's actually, especially in mammals, there's a lot of repercussions of that. So, which tends to be negative for the population. But again, this is just representing what's happening with one gene. But the same thing would be happening for genes that you can't see visually. All right. So let me get back to my pointer. Here. All right. So one concept that's related to genetic drift, or that's a subtopic of genetic drift, is something called the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect is when you have a population, and in this picture they're just showing maybe these beads represent the different alleles in the gene pool for one gene. So let's say there's 3 different alleles, the pink, the red, and the green, whatever that is. And each individual can only have 2 alleles at a time, but in the whole gene pool you have this collection of alleles. And then some catastrophe happens. It can be like a forest fire, something that whoever survives, it's just lucky. It's not selection. There is no mutation or no allele that's going to select you or protect you from a forest fire. It's just whoever found a cave to hide in. So whoever survives, just lucky. It's kind of like quite literally what shakes out of the bottle. So like you give the bottle a few shakes, and this represents the survivors. So the ones that survived collectively, there's only a couple of them, and there's a fair amount, there's still a good amount of pink alleles and 2 greens, but none of the reds. Or you could have a shake that you got, really proportionally too many greens compared to what was in the original population. Or you could get a shake that had more reds than what was in the original population. But whatever you get, that becomes the founding population for the new repopulation of the forest. So in other words, from now on, if this small group is going to repopulate, all of the alleles have to come from this beginning pool here, because these guys all died in the forest fire. And so what typically happens is you'll get a new population, or you know, the next generation will have proportionately different allele frequencies based on whatever happens to shake out, whatever survives. In a similar way, you have something called the founder effect. The founder effect is where a small group of individuals just move from the original population somewhere else. So in that case, there doesn't have to be a catastrophe. The original population is still there, like maybe on a mainland. This is a pretty common scenario. Like you have, let's say, the Galapagos Islands, let's say. So you have, I'm going to draw South America. And if you know me, you know two things. Number one, I'm not good with geography. And number two, I can't draw. And I can't get a pen to come up. Let's see if I can do this. Okay, so let's say you have South America. Okay, okay, there it is. It looks like a slice of pizza the way I draw it. And over here are the Galapagos Islands. So for the founder effect, you might have a big population over here of something, and then a couple individuals, either maybe by boat. Here's a boat. That's good. Goes over, or maybe if it's birds, maybe they fly, I don't know. Somehow individuals get from the mainland to the island, but not all the individuals, so just a couple, and it's just random, whoever gets on the boat. So then when you get over here, the islands are repopulated based on the small group that creates the founder of the new colony here. And so again, in the founder effect, you don't have, the original population doesn't have to go away. They don't have to die. But the new population is just a couple of individuals, and whatever their genetic makeup is creates a new population, which could have a very different genetic structure than the mainland population. So that's another concept, the founder effect. The founder effect is typically more, I hate it when this does that. Founder effect. I don't know why it does that. But the founder effect is more about a group moving from one area to another, and the new group doesn't represent the exact allele structure of the original group. The bottleneck effect is more associated with like some kind of massive catastrophe that causes the original group to get down to just a few individuals. Now, honestly, the bottleneck effect is really what we as humans are causing when we cause deforestation. Deforestation causes a lot of animals and plants to lose their habitat, and then maybe there's a few survivors, but they're not going to be representative of the original population. So humans can cause a lot of these catastrophes that lead to the bottleneck effect for another group. All right, gene flow. Gene flow is a pretty simple concept. It's either when an individual goes from one population to another. Of course, it has to be the same species, but one geographic location maybe has all these brown beetles, a different geographic location has these green ones, and if one of them moves from one location to the other, then that's gene flow, because they carry their alleles with them, they carry their gametes with them. The only thing about gene flow is there has to be a significant number of individuals that move, and there has to be a significant difference in the genetic structure of the two populations. Because if these two populations are both pretty much the same genetically, then it really doesn't matter if some of them move. That's really not going to change the genetic structure of any of the groups. So remember, we're talking about evolution. Gene flow is migration, either emigration or immigration, that changes the genetic structure. Typically, it's going to change the genetic structure of the group that the migration goes into, although it can be the other way as well. But once this brown guy comes in, it's bringing in a new allele, and that by definition changes the genetic structure of the green population. But you have to have a significant number of individuals migrating, and there has to be a difference in the genetics so that it causes a change, typically in the receiving group. So there's some limitations on gene flow. If you have two populations that are basically genetically similar, then it really doesn't matter if there's gene flow. That's not going to change either group. So they have to be significantly different, and then the gene flow will change the receiving group. All right, we are going to talk about natural selection as a driver of evolution and artificial selection. But one of the rules of selection is that you'll remember this from our chapter on Darwin, is the selection is aimed at a phenotype favoring or not favoring a phenotype, but the phenotype has to be caused by genes. So then the question is, well, what phenotypes are not caused by genes? There are plenty of phenotypes that are completely environmental. This one gives an example of the gender, the sex of an alligator is determined by the temperature of incubation of the eggs. So that characteristic would not be subject to natural selection because it's not genetically controlled. So in some reptiles, the incubation temperature of the egg determines the sex. So genetically, a male and a female are exactly the same. It's just if you incubate the egg at a certain temperature, it causes some male enzymes to be more functional. If you incubate it at a different temperature, it causes the female enzymes to be more functional. So it doesn't have anything to do with particular genotypes. So any time when you have a trait that's completely environmentally controlled, then that trait would not be subject to selection. So just something to keep in mind. So if I describe on the exam, on the test, or the quiz, a scenario where it's a completely environmentally controlled phenotype, then natural selection would not occur in that scenario. All right, but let's talk about natural selection actually in general. The concept that some individuals will be more successful and leave more offspring than others, and that difference, if it's controlled by genotype, then those alleles will be more represented in the next generation. So there's two types of selection, artificial and natural. And artificial selection is the term used when humans are the ones making the selection. If we say natural selection, we are saying that some other aspect of nature is making the selection. So in the rock pocket mice, the owls are making the selection, the predator. So that would be natural. Okay, so here are the rules. We looked at these earlier in a different chapter. The three parts of natural selection. There must be genetic, or it could be, I guess it can be also for artificial selection. There must be genetic variation. There has to be competition for resources and mates and survival, such that favored individuals are more likely to pass on their alleles, and therefore, when this is allowed to run generation over generation, the favored alleles will be more frequent over time. Now, natural selection and evolution are not the same thing. Remember, evolution, there are 5 drivers of evolution. Natural selection is one of the drivers, or what we could say one mechanism, one of the processes that causes evolution to happen. Evolution is simply any case where there is a change in genetic structure over time. But natural selection is the only mechanism that drives adaptive evolution, meaning the populations become better adapted to their environment. And so what that means is that, gene flow is neither adaptive nor not really adaptive or not adaptive. It's just change. Genetic drift is just change. It doesn't have to be positive or negative. It's just a change. In fact, genetic drift tends to be a negative overall, loss of genetic variation. But natural selection, that one, of the 5 drivers of evolution, natural selection is the one that consistently tends to create adaptations or result in adaptations. You'll remember from the rock pocket mice that mutation happens all the time. I mentioned earlier you can blame DNA polymerase for most of it, like 60% or something like that is a guess. But mutation happens all the time. That causes new alleles in the population, and then if there is a trait that is favored, then natural selection will result in that allele becoming more common in the population. All right, I'm going to end this segment now, and there will be a third lecture segment